Today's First Chapter Fridays is History Smashers the Mayflower by Kate Messner. Kate Messner has written several books in the History Smashers series, including Women's Right to Vote, History Smashers Pearl Harbor, History Smashers Titanic, History Smashers The American Revolution, History Smashers Plagues and Pandemics, and I believe just coming out is going to be History Smashers Underground Railroad. So we have several of these in the library, but today we're going to talk about History Smashers The Mayflower, since it's close to Thanksgiving time. This is a narrative nonfiction book. So that means it's nonfiction, which means it's not fake, which means it's true. And it is a narrative in the sense that it kind of tells a story. There's definitely a lot of facts and tidbits in here, and those things make it kind of fun and engaging, I think, but it reads like a story. So I put it in the narrative nonfiction section. I think you're going to like it. I'm actually not going to start at chapter 1. Chapter 1 has a lot of background information, which would be helpful for you if you're reading the whole book. But if we're just going to read an excerpt, I'm actually going to start at the beginning of chapter 2, which is chapter 2, Voyage on the Mayflower, but not on the Speedwell. You might think this is the part of the story where the Pilgrims board the Mayflower, cross the ocean, land in Plymouth, and live happily ever after. But the real deal was more complicated than that. For starters, the Pilgrims couldn't go anywhere until they figured out how to pay for their trip. Kind of like now. It would be expensive. They didn't just need a ship. They needed enough supplies to last through the journey in their early days in the new colony. Brewster and his separatists didn't have that kind of money. They needed to make a deal. So I want to show you how in this book there are a lot of things, like in certain places there are these little comics and different kinds of things. So I'll show you some of these as we're going along. This one's called Let's Make a Deal. The separatists made an agreement with the Virginia Company, which had received a charter to establish settlements in what is now called North America. The deal worked like this. The separatists would be given some land along with money and supplies to make the journey. In return, once they got settled, they'd send natural resources like timber, furs, and fish back to England. The Virginia Company had already sent people to set up a colony in Jamestown and was making plans for another settlement farther north. That's where the Pilgrims came into the picture. The Virginia Company gave them a patent, a document giving them permission to settle in Virginia. It's worth noting that their permission came from the King of England, who'd never set foot in Virginia. What made him think he had the right to give away land on a continent he had never even visited? The answer to that question has to do with a set of laws called the Doctrine of Discovery. It was based on a 1452, that's the year 1452, decree from the Pope. And here's the pictures that go along with that. 1452 decree, the Doctrine of Discovery, said that Christian people could go into the lands of any non-Christians, take their land and resources, and enslave the people who live there. People who weren't Christian weren't looked at as human beings. By the 1620s, this was a popular belief, and it set the stage for Europeans to settle in other people's lands, so not just the United States. So now the Pilgrims had a patent of their own, giving them permission from the King of England to settle in Virginia. But if you're imagining them sailing to the modern-day state of Virginia, you need to think again. In the time of the Pilgrims, the land that what the English called the colony of Virginia was way bigger than the state we know now. The colony actually stretched all the way from Jamestown north to the mouth of the Hudson River in what is now New York State. The patent that the Pilgrims received gave them permission to settle in the northern part of the colony of Virginia near the mouth of the Hudson River. Here's the map right there. It's basically right where it's now basically New York City. William Brewster's separatists weren't the only ones who made the trip. Other people, known as adventurers, went too. They weren't part of the separatist religious group. They wanted to go to America for other reasons. Some thought they might get rich in the new colonies, so they decided to tag along with the separatists. It sounded like a perfect plan. In July 1620, Brewster and the other separatists in Leyden sold most of their possessions and boarded a ship. Can you guess the name of that ship? What do you think it was? If you guessed the Mayflower, guess again. Their ship was called the Speedwell. Brewster and his separatists knew the journey would be long and dangerous, but they were ready. The dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible, Bradford wrote. It was finally time to set sail for Plymouth Rock, right? Well, not yet. First, they set their course for the English port city of Southampton, where they would meet up with another ship. That ship had been hired by a different group of separatists. They'd also decided to leave home and head for Virginia. They didn't have to sneak away like Brewster's group. They'd been given permission to leave. They had hired a ship for their voyage, too. Can you guess the name of that one? If you said the Mayflower, this time you're right. The ship was 100 feet long and 25 feet wide with 3 tall masts. The Mayflower and the Speedwell met in Southampton. With the two groups together, the Pilgrim's journey across the sea was ready to begin. But before they even set out, there were signs that the trip would not be smooth sailing. The Speedwell had already sprung a leak and needed repairs. Once the work was complete, the two ships set sail. With good winds, they figured they'd make it across the ocean in as little as 6 weeks. But that didn't work out. Almost immediately, the Speedwell started leaking again. This time it was even worse. A passenger named Robert Cushman wrote about it in a letter to a friend. If we had stayed at sea but 3 or 4 hours more, she would have sunk right down. And though she was twice trimmed at Hampton, yet now she is open and leaky as a sieve. I don't know if you know what a sieve is, but it's basically like a colander with lots of holes. You can't sail a sieve, so both ships turned around and went back to England. It took about a week for workers to fix the leaks. When the repairs were complete, the Pilgrims set sail again. The next time they pulled into shore, they'd be in Plymouth. But not Plymouth, Massachusetts. 300 miles into the journey, the Speedwell started leaking yet again. So once more, both boats turned around. They ended up in the English city of Plymouth. And this time, the ship wasn't so easy to fix. They looked for the leak but couldn't find it. So what was the problem? Was the Speedwell just a crummy ship? Only one thing was certain: the Speedwell couldn't be fixed this time. The Mayflower would have to cross the ocean alone. So now what? Some of the passengers decided that they didn't want to go to America after all. They should have been there by now. Instead, they'd spent 6 weeks at sea, only to end up back in England. Perhaps that was a sign that this new settlement wasn't such a great idea. Mr. Cushman of the leaky Speedwell letter was among those who called it quits. Summer had turned to September by the time the rest of the passengers piled onto the Mayflower. They'd already used up a lot of their supplies, so they loaded more for the journey. Then the Mayflower left England with 102 passengers and about 30 crew members on board. Finally, they were on their way, but it would still be months before the Pilgrims made it to the place that they would call Plymouth. So this next section says Mayflower class of 1620, and it has a list of a bunch of the passengers who were famous on the famously now famous that are on the Mayflower, like William Bradford, William Brewster, John Carver, Miles Standish, Edward Winslow, and John Alden. So you might have heard of some of those when you were learning about the first Thanksgiving in the past. But then it has several pages that are the not so famous Mayflower passengers. These Mayflower passengers aren't as well known, but their stories are just as interesting. For example, the Didn't Pack Light Award. Mayflower passenger William Mullins was from an English town called Dorking. Among the luggage he brought to Plymouth were 250 shoes and 13 pairs of boots. Spoiler, Mullins wasn't a 17th century fashionista, he was a shoemaker. And there's his picture. The first Pilgrim mother to give birth after the voyage award. William and Susanna White came to Plymouth on the Mayflower with their 5-year-old son, Resolved. Another son, Peregrine, was born on the ship in Provincetown Harbor soon after they arrived. The last Mayflower Survivor Award. Mary Allerton Cushman was 4 years old when she boarded the Mayflower with her parents, Isaac and Mary. She was the last surviving Mayflower passenger when she died in 1699. And then it goes on for a few more. So that is basically the gist of History Smashers, the Mayflower, and other History Smashers book have this similar format, and it goes through with some examples. There are some actual photographs and diagrams, and there's some comics, and there's some primary sources like that little piece from the letter and things like that in it. So it's got a lot of good stuff, and the goal of these books is it's called History Smashers because it's trying to kind of upgrade what people think they know about some of these issues. And they're very fun to read, so I highly recommend them.